Hello, everyone. My name is Nicholas Prohatko, and I am co-chair of the Joint Council's Research Committee and Director of Research at the ICCS. Welcome to this webinar presenting the Deloitte study on innovative self-service practices commissioned by the Joint Council's Research Committee on behalf of the Public Sector Service Delivery Council and the Public Sector Chief Information Officers Council. This is the first of two webinars on the study. The second, on May 22nd, will focus on the self-service maturity model developed as part of the study. Self-service has been identified by the councils as a key research priority, informing and supporting the goals of more cost-effective and better quality services to citizens and businesses. The purpose of the study is to give council and research committee members a clearer understanding of the trends in self-service in both the public and private sectors, nationally and internationally, and the implications for Canadian public sector service providers. The format of today's webinar will include a presentation by Deloitte, followed by Q's and A's. You can send your questions as they occur to you in the course of the presentation using the chat box on your screen. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Richard Carson, the partner at Deloitte responsible for guiding this study. Richard is a leader in Deloitte's customer practice in Canada, with a particular focus on citizen service delivery across channels. His consulting focus across Canadian and international clients is on customer and citizen growth strategy, multi-channel operations, government strategy for economic and business growth, customer service, and customer-focused transformations. Richard has over 10 years experience in senior roles in the private retail sector and 17 years of global consulting experience. His focus at Deloitte is to help public sector clients link strategic plans around customer, citizens, channels, and products with action and implementation in the marketplace. Richard, thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Well, great. Thanks, Nicholas. And good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast, and good morning for anyone participating from out west. Thank you, Nicholas, for that introduction, and of course for the opportunity to work together with you folks at the ICCS. It certainly has been a great experience for us. As Nicholas mentioned, what I wanted to do in today's webinar, over about 40 minutes, is to give you an executive summary of the study of innovative self-service practices that we performed for the ICCS. And there's a full report that is now out. Nicholas has access to, and I'm going to go through. I'm going to see a top line of the key findings, which I think was a very interesting study for all of us who were involved. And as Nicholas mentioned, we're going to reserve a good chunk of time at the end of this discussion for any comments or questions. And there will be another webinar next week, as you'll see a bit of a deeper dive into a particular tool for assessment of self-services that we developed as part of this engagement. So as you can see on this first page, the objectives of this webinar are first to provide an overview of the recent study, and more importantly, I would suggest the implications for us in Canada and for the various organizations that you represent. How can you use this study? What are the insights? What are the implications? And then finally, to introduce the self-serve maturity model that we'll go into more detail next week. Just a quick few words on the study objectives. This was a 12-week study that we performed over last winter, fall and winter, sort of November to January timeframe. Again, the focus was the global self-service innovations, the side of citizen service, with particular emphasis, as you can see on the left-hand side of this slide too, on areas such as identity management, multi-channel management, the migration from intense in-person or call center channels to more self-serve channels and less costly ones, the idea of end-to-end service integration, and finally service bundling. So these 5 topics were of particular interest as we went into this study. But then in addition, to develop tools that would help public sector organizations in Canada, not just to assess where you are versus best practices or versus your peers, but how do you plan your own self-service strategies? And at the end of this presentation, I hope you'll see some very pragmatic recommendations that we have developed in that spirit. So again, it was a 12-week study, a combination of direct interviews with desk research of literature that was available, plus a number of more in-depth case studies that you'll see in the full report. The little map on the bottom right of slide 2 that I'm showing you has a number of key organizations, combination of both public sector and private sector, that we did a bit of a deeper dive to try and understand where these organizations were in the whole self-service topic. As I said, the report is now out. This is what it looks like, and just a high level of table of comments. You can see it obviously has a bit of a user guide to it, talks about key issues in the Canadian public sector, the trends that we have found, and then leading practices in a number of areas. It has a section on costs and investments, which we'll go into a little bit in this webinar today, and then obviously goes into a lot more detail on the self-service maturity framework, and then a conclusion part of what are the insights and what are the implications for Canadian public sector organizations. So first, if I can, on slide 4, I think it's very important to set up the context for this whole topic. And this is the world that we face here in Canada. I think many of you are familiar with, but it's really driving a lot of the migration to self-service, and really the essence of why this topic is of such high interest, not just in Canada, but in many other jurisdictions around the world that we have interacted with. And the very first one, as you can see, and no surprise, is fiscal pressures. The notion that governments at all levels, whether it's federal, provincial, municipal, are under significant pressures in terms of managing their costs, managing their budgets, significant debt levels in most jurisdictions. And that is the culture that I know we all know, many of you are working in. The idea of cost control and extreme scrutiny over any expenditure. And so part of that is the context. But another important one, as you can see on the slide 4, is the notion of programs and services today within governments and across levels of governments are often deemed to be quite fragmented. They can be considered inefficient, they're uncoordinated, so that from a citizen standpoint, often people have to integrate, they have to interact across programs, which can be quite cumbersome because they're not coordinated, and the whole citizen experience is one where we're forcing citizens to do a lot of work, if you will, as they access our services, as they try to navigate through the variety of programs that are offered within government and across levels of government. A third aspect, of course, is technology. And what we are hearing as we interact with folks, and again, this isn't just in Canada, but this is around the world as well, is that government systems and processes haven't necessarily kept up with the rapid changes in technology. And especially in the last 5 years, we've seen a plethora of new advances in various applications, various technology solutions, and it's everything from functionality to the way technology is delivered, such as cloud solutions that everyone would probably be familiar with. But then what goes along with that is often a very interesting change in the cost of technology. Technology is becoming a lot less expensive than it used to be, to the point that government, in many cases, are sitting on technologies that maybe were designed for very good reasons a number of years ago, but that are either coming up to end of life or perhaps are even obsolete already. A fourth set of context is the growing client sophistication. And we see that with citizens, we see that with customers in the private sector, and whether it's sophistication because we are a very demographically diverse country, whether it's people are much more technology savvy, they know how to use the internet, regardless of their age or their economic status. Canada, as I think most of you know, has a very high proportion of citizens online, and we find the quality of information people have access to is really incredible, so that they understand what they should, or they developed higher expectations, as you can see on the bottom. They have a very good information base, and with that, they want better, more convenient access to services. They want government to in turn be responsive to them, to be transparent with them, and so this is a challenge that government faces. And so when you put these five elements together, we know that governments are facing a very tricky situation. In other words, higher expectations, higher demand for service, though less money necessarily to spend on them, and an infrastructure, whether it's of programs or of technology, that isn't necessarily ready to meet those higher expectations and that lower cost. So a very tricky context for self-service in Canada. As we move beyond Canada to global trends in self-service, what you'll see on slide 5 are 6 key trends that we have identified in this whole area. And hopefully, I don't think any of these will be a surprise, but I think they're very, very important, because what we are seeing, as you can see, is very first the notion of choice of channels. Of much more of a citizen-centric world where citizens are being given convenience. They're being allowed to access government through the channel of their choice. And it's not just only web or only mobile and so on, or only phone, but it's accessing those channels when they want and interacting between them. It might be web from your house for a particular reason, in person, another day for another reason, but citizens having the choice of how and when to access government. That notion of access with the citizen focus in mind is critical. But then in addition, it's access in a customized manner. It's citizens being offered more personalized service. And whether it's more personalized service based on the bundle of services that they are typically getting, whether it's personalized based on their demographic, who they are, such as language, such as age, that notion of using technology now to give citizens a more customized and even more personalized offering is something that we're certainly seeing. We're also seeing citizens being given control, and this is a little bit similar to the convenience topic, but control over decision making. Control is empowering, as you can see. It helps the citizen to be a lot more assured around things like security, things like privacy, but the citizens being allowed to decide how much information to give government and when to give it. We're also seeing a lot of collaboration occur. And so the notion of social media, the notion of public forums, in other words, various communities rising that reinforce channel choice, that encourage repeat use. And we're seeing this quite a bit in terms of citizens coming together on their own initiative in social media forums that are available to them, and through that, figuring out how they want to deal with government. And often this is where I think the expectations are rising, and this is where people are realizing what they can ask government for. And this notion of collaboration we're certainly seeing quite a bit of. Consistency. And so again, related to the first one, is the notion of an integrated channel experience. And so as you encounter, as you access government across different channels, it's the notion of that experience being coordinated, whether it's the information of who you are, your identity, or perhaps your past interactions with government, or perhaps just consistency in terms of the type of information that's given. The idea that a description of a certain service or program in one channel is consistent with how it's presented in others. And that, I think, as you all know, where you have services being updated quite frequently, you have service innovation occurring, that notion of having to have the content across channels to be consistent and updated is not necessarily an easy endeavor. And the last one is around convergence, and specifically technology convergence. Having platforms really on any device that help citizens access government, and that also reduce the cost of service delivery. And so as we all think of ourselves, and whether it's the smartphones we're using, or perhaps the tablets that we're using, that have obviously grown so much in market share and household share, it's the notion of whatever technology is driving service, it's delivered across all of these platforms to, again, allow the citizen the choice. So I think just to summarize this notion of global trends, when a lot of people talk about the idea of citizen-focused service delivery, these are a lot of the elements that we're actually seeing out there in the marketplace, often in the public sector, but private sector as well. Let's then go into the next section, which is a little deeper dive, if you will, on leading practices in self-service. And on page 7, as you'll see, what we've labeled or described here, based on this research we did, and by the way, based on interactions with a number of folks from ICCS that helped to edit and help to add to this, are these 7 different practices specifically for self-service. And I'm just going to describe them at a higher level right now, and then you'll see the next couple of pages will go into a little more detail, and then of course the full report has a lot more detail on each of these. But you'll see number 1 is all around authentication and identity management. And this is what you might call one of the key infrastructure aspects of self-service that really is so important. It's to help verify, help manage, and help maintain common client identities across services, so that when you do register as a citizen for Service A or Department A, you then go in and need to change your address or update your profile. The citizen isn't being asked to do that multiple times across departments when it's just much more easy through technology to have a one and done kind of approach. If you move, you give government, whatever level you're working with, that information about your current address or current profile, and that goes into some sort of authentication identity management system so that you as a citizen only have to give that information once. That's what they expect from us. And by the way, that's what they do get in many cases in the private sector, whether it's a financial institution or other service providers they might deal with. And so, of course, just want to put that note in that often citizen expectations are driven by the service they do get in other sectors, often the private sector. Just moving on, a second one are proactive strategies to encourage migration from one channel to another, typically from higher cost to lower cost channels, so that we can actually help those adopt self-service. And often what we are seeing out there is there might be self-service initiatives underway, there might be self-service capabilities put in place across different jurisdictions, but we see a real leading practice to be very proactive in encouraging that. And whether it's encouraging that through lower fees for a low-cost channel, or simply it could be education about how to use self-service. But that notion of proactive migration is the idea that just because we offer the service, it doesn't necessarily mean that citizens will take it up and go to that lower-cost self-service channel. We have to manage that. We have to migrate them proactively. And we'll talk in a few minutes about how some of the tactics used to do that. It's the notion of assisted self-service, number 3, the idea that not all citizens want a pure self-service offering, either because they're unable or they're unwilling to do that. And so rather than what you might call pure self-service, it's having assisted self-service when citizens want that. That might be a CSR on the phone that's able to help out. That might be in person, a coach in some ways. But that notion of assisted self-service which you could argue is a little bit related to number 2. In other words, assisted self-service to show them that it's not that hard, to show them that self-service is something that people can do and actually have a better service level in many cases. Number 4, the notion of seamless delivery of services and client experience across channels. And again, this notion of, to the degree we have an uncoordinated channel experience, even to the point of getting contradictory information in one channel versus another, citizens will typically go to the channel they trust most, in a historical way, which often is a live person, often whether it's over the phone or whether it's in person, and to find out what the real scoop is. In other words, we need to make sure that all channels are coordinated in a seamless way so we can give them the confidence that when they do get self-service, it's going to be correct self-service. They don't have to second-guess us about the quality or the consistency of that information or that transaction. Another one is what you might call, number 5, what we call the robust business architecture. And the whole point is what kind of background, what kind of backbone, I should say, architecture is required to do this. And we'll get into some examples of that. End-to-end, number 6 is end-to-end service integration, bundling of services. And it might be life events, it might be across programs, across levels of government. And I would suggest this is one where in Canada we see some great examples of this. And by the way, it's not just within governments, but across different levels of government, municipal to provincial, provincial to federal, and various combinations. But that notion of starting to work with service bundling is something that we do see a lot of progress in, and we believe is quite important. And finally, enhanced user experiences. In other words, customizing channel experiences to meet client needs. And I'll get into some examples of what that means in a minute. And you'll see on the next couple of slides that what we do is we have some specific examples of those same categories. And I'm not going to go through them in great detail because they are in the report and you might have questions on them later. But as you can see, some of the, and by the way, the best practice examples on the right aren't necessarily foreign ones. There's a lot of great innovation occurring, we believe, here in Canada. But as you can see on that first one, some of the leading practices for identity management, for authentication, whether it's federated entities, various ways of data verification. There's a lot of experimentation out there in terms of biometrics, whether it's retinal scans or voice prints, other aspects of identity management like that. But again, that's a key foundation. In terms of channel migration and adoption, a couple of the practices, some things like mandatory digital services, only offering a certain service in a digital way, in an online self-service way. We do believe that is not only possible, but that actually could be important in some cases. We put the notion of price discrimination down there. I'm not sure if I like that word. I would much rather call that pricing strategy. But the point is that if you do know that it's less costly to deliver self-service in an online format, why not pass along some of that pricing benefit to citizens, again, often in a way to encourage them to migrate. But we certainly see a number of jurisdictions out there experimenting with and executing different types of pricing strategies across channels. Assisted self-service, again, the notion that people need to be coached, need to be taught, need to be helped at times. And so service centers where we do have click-to-chat capabilities, we do have video and phone support, and even we do have broad campaigns. The UK, over the past number of years, have had a broad campaign to try to encourage seniors in the UK society to get online and enlisting various people from the public at large to basically act as coaches for that. So that assisted self-service can be on a one-to-one basis when you need it, but it also can be a broad government-wide program aimed at the population at large. The notion of number 4, again, we talked about seamless multi-channel management. So some of the tactics out there, channel markers certainly used quite a bit. Social data mining we see growing quite significantly over the past couple of years. In other words, having a much better sense of where people are using social media, where different brand name services are coming up in social media, and as a result, using that citizen feedback to try to improve experiences, try to understand where experiences might be either falling short or perhaps doing quite well. Speech analytics as well is an area that we certainly see as growing quite significantly. Moving on to page 9, just continuing these some examples of self-service innovation. You'll see service integration and bundling. We do see a fair bit of work in client segmentation. I think our perspective is that that's not absolutely critical. It's often life and business event as opposed to a more formal integration, a demographic or other form of segmentation that we're seeing. But certainly service integration and service bundling we are seeing quite a bit of. And as I mentioned before, I think here in Canada in particular, some great examples of that. The idea of a robust business architecture, whether it's a technology architecture or whether it's organizational or process related, so things like centralized task forces, whether it's things like mobile access for some of the new technologies being used and some of the new applications and devices, whether it's smartphones or tablets. That notion of that business architecture needed to be flexible for the device of the citizen's choice is something that we feel is quite important. And last but not least, the idea of an enhanced user experience. So it might be a personalized web portal where once you do identify yourself, it customizes the content to what your needs are, or perhaps what they believe that provider thinks your needs are based on who you are. The idea, again, of a rapid and dynamic search. I talked a bit before about speech recognition. And then outbound service. So the notion of automated notifications. We understand or we know through our records that your passport is going to expire. Just using that as an example, here's a way for you to renew that service or renew that whatever that program is in an automated way to help the citizen save time, save money, and of course do that in a self-service way. So obviously a number of best practices that we think are very interesting. I think before I go into this slide 10, a comment that we don't see anyone out there, and I would say either private sector or public sector, who claims to have succeeded in an end-to-end manner in self-service. This is not easy. They all claim that they are making progress in various aspects of it. They are learning, but as I say, no one will stand up and say that they have the end-to-end sort of self-service business model figured out, especially as you consider my points before about how it needs to be integrated across other channels. And so this is a complicated area. But people do say that they are getting strong benefits and strong outcomes. And so this page 10 tries to describe 3 very different but I think important benefits. One, of course, is reduced costs. And to the degree we can migrate service from in-person or staff-intense interactions to more lower-cost channels, and I'll show you some numbers in a minute, there's certainly some significant cost-saving potential. It's improvements in end-to-end processing and service cycle time in terms of back office, whether it's handling the mail or handling fax. So in other words, we're reducing labor costs because we can move to an automated business model and business processes as opposed to paper-based or manual ones. And also the rationalization of technology systems. So as we can bring departments together or jurisdictions together, levels of government together, there's certainly that notion that by pooling together technologies or standardizing technologies, there can be cost savings there. And example below, I think it was with Aetna, when they had a virtual agent, they were able to decrease the number of help desk calls, as you can see in this case, by almost 30%. Caveats that we all know, though, is that this requires investment. It requires change management, which isn't necessarily easy. And as I mentioned before, it requires migration of that service to self-service channels, which often is a real education of your citizen, and that's not necessarily an easy task. Typically what I hear is this is over a 5 to 10 year time frame is often required to really get a lot of the benefit from start to finish. So these reduced costs certainly are not necessarily a launch it right away and get those cost savings in the first month or two. But then related to that, we have improved operating efficiencies. So what we do see right now is a lot of redundant processes that perhaps were designed for very good reasons years ago when self-serve wasn't available, or perhaps whether it's a signature, whether it's related to identity management, related to simply numbers of copies of a form required, but processes that haven't necessarily been changed because there was no imperative to. And so the point that as we see people going into more self-service business models, they're often reviewing a lot of the processes they have and asking those important questions of, do we still need to do that in this way now that we have different types of technology, different types of opportunity for self-service in front of us? And so related to that is handoffs and manual processing. Error rates can certainly go down in terms of operating efficiency, and even reducing the number of interactions. So that notion of one and done, or at least serving the citizen in a manner where they don't have to interact with us as many times, is quite important. You can see that one example underneath, a report from Australia, that the smart form initiatives realized almost a 10-to-1 savings compared to the investment required. And I think the important note is that that's one example. We know that they vary quite a bit. Again, the investment cost in some of these can be very significant, and especially when we are in an era of fiscal restraint, that upfront investment, we know, often needs to be balanced with cost savings, with real savings, and savings that occur earlier than later in the life cycle of that program. But then thirdly, the idea of enhanced client experience. So it's the time spent by clients, by citizens, to interact with government, whether it's physical time or the time to go to an in-person facility, as an example. It's better access, better choice of access points, and the notion of customization and better functionality. And so we certainly see a lot of benefit from client experiences. But the problem, again, is that those benefits aren't always quantifiable. In other words, I find that a lot of organizations typically will look to those other things on the left-hand side of this, on the pure cost side, or at least the quantified operating efficiencies, as opposed to the client experience, which often is a qualitative feedback we have. Of course, we can do surveys and kind of customer satisfaction research, but the cost side of this, I find, often overrides everything else. So a little more detail on costs and investments, and this is a tricky area. The numbers you see are approximate costs per contact. As you can see, we go from sort of high to low in terms of the channels of contact, starting with call centers, where you do need in-person interaction, perhaps a technical person or just a general CSR, all the way down to providing basic information on web self-service, which can be very, very inexpensive. But I think a couple of caveats to this, which are very, very important. One is that this information is not readily available. And just to give you a bit of a hint of one of the recommendations, is to actually start capturing your cost of transactions. and ideally your all-in costs, which really include all your investments. Because although we do show some ranges here, this is where we do get some big ranges. Some outliers, I should say, which really make the business case a little more tricky. So, for example, what we do see out there is a lot of, I think, focus has been given on the call center channel in the last number of years, and call center channel costs have actually come down quite a bit. People will tell us that they can get their call center costs down to $3 to $6, which when you compare that not to the variable cost of the internet or self-service online, but the cost of technology, the investment required to go online, often it makes that business case a little less compelling. And so where people say, the business case to go from in-person to phone to web-based self-service is a no-brainer, sometimes that can be challenged by what the actual costs are. And so the notion is not all interactions are suitable for self-service delivery, but what we typically find is that those routine, high-volume transactions are the places where we find people usually start first and usually find the business case to be more compelling. But the actual fact base of what those costs are quite critical. You absolutely need that. I'm going to spend a few minutes on our self-service maturity framework, not a lot of time because I'm going to talk a little bit more of that on the second webinar we do next week, I believe. But here's a little bit of a taste of what it is, which I think is quite important. And this notion of a maturity framework is one we use across a lot of sectors. For this initiative, we developed one specifically for the self-service topic. And I'll try to explain how this works in a few slides. As you can see on this slide 13, I think it is. I can't see how small that number is. Anyway, you'll see that there's a number of different functions. So we talk about self-service maturity from the notion of channels, from the notion of client functions, in other words, the type of activities, from the notion of management functions, so what we're doing behind the scenes, and finally in terms of our technology and infrastructure. And as you'll see on slide 14, with these same four functions, so channels, client functions, management functions, and technology, what we've done is we've customized an approach whereby in each of these we've come up with a number of subcategories. So the channels are pretty obvious. We've broken out for specific channels. For the client functions, you can see that we've devised 6 very high-level processes that clients or citizens typically go through. They get information from us, they identify themselves, right through to they get their service fulfilled or their issue resolved. You'll see 4 different management functions. So the notion of strategy, of processes, of performance management, and finally organization and culture. And then you'll see a final grouping on technology and infrastructure, where again, what we're doing is we're looking at channels, personalization, and so on, through to data warehousing. And what we've done, and I'm just going to continue to move through this document, and this page 15 is an illustration, but what it basically shows you in the actual tool, for any one of these elements, we've got, as you can see, 5 different descriptions of the stage of maturity you're at. So in other words, 5 stages. From the left, what you might call very, very basic, emergent, as we call it, to a little more, sophisticated, we call it developing, to define, to mature, and finally to what you might call the best practices, transformative. And so based on all the research we did for this initiative, what we tried to do for each of those aspects on slide 14 is come up with a description of where you are, where you would be, for each of these 5 stages of on the maturity framework. And what this allows you to do, and I just flip the slide to the self-assessment tool, is for any one of these, for you to look at this description, for you to look at how we've defined a certain level of maturity, and then have you put it in. And what we can do is we can compare that to what the best practice is. It's a very interesting tool. I'll explain more next week, but you can, in a workshop setting, you can have a number of individuals fill this out and have a great conversation about why one person might have thought it was a 2 versus another thought it was a 4. Or if we collectively think we're at a level 2 and the best practice is a 5, where do we want to be in the future? In other words, we don't expect and we don't believe it's possible necessarily to be best practice on every single dimension, but are there particular ones where we feel there's a significant gap and it does make sense to invest or focus on that particular capability and try to enhance where you are. So, and I promise, again, next week I'm going to go into more detail on that. But I said I was going to take about 40-45 minutes, and so I want to just spend about 3 or 4 minutes on the conclusions, and then Nicholas and Robert will open up to the floor for any questions or any comments. So, as you can see, the conclusions, we do believe that a common authentication infrastructure is required. So for identity management, for authentication, and this is really a key enabler of self-service. And this is often one that that we see in the private sector. Investments are being made, and this is one important place to start. The idea of reducing channel friction, and that helps us accelerate adoption. So it's some simple, well-designed, user-centric services, and where we really can deliver convenience and access to citizens. It's the idea of cross-functional self-service task forces that can start to get things done. And I think this is really important because what we often find is that a lot of this material is not necessarily new to various governments that we interact with. Often the problem is there's a lot of well-intentioned initiatives being struck on any one of these topics, but the problem is they're not coordinated with each other. And there isn't a cross-functional approach to it, to sort of think about how do we want to have a coordinated approach to self-service or to digital service. So that notion of whether it's centralized or at least coordinated task force trying to organize this is really, really important. The idea that smaller size helps, country size, scale of complexity, does seem to have an influence on digital service, but doesn't preclude it. And so, you know, I think that it's just important to say that if you do have a smaller base in terms of your population, in terms of the complexity of your programs, that can be useful. But on the other hand, if you do have a much larger jurisdiction, you then have much more critical mass. I would argue the more complex your jurisdiction, your service offering is, the more important it is to start with a small number of important services. And again, that notion of routine high volume transactions, we believe is quite important. And finally, in terms of conclusions, the notion that policy changes might be required. Laws, legislative implications might be there, where perhaps we had laws designed for an era that was much more conducive to in-person service, but now where we do have more opportunities for citizen interaction, there might be policy changes, either legislation or perhaps policies respecting with respect to specific programs that might need to be changed, or it might be an opportunity to change, and I think that's quite important to note. Some key messages. We do think that self-service is not just an important topic, but it really is the future. It really is the future due to these aspects of customers or citizens are looking for it, financial realities demand it, and new technology exists. Those three aspects of customers are looking for it, we can't necessarily afford higher cost service delivery models as perhaps we did in the past, but also new technology capabilities are required. Those three things I think are quite important. This notion of self-service is not only here to stay, but it's also, we believe, going to grow quite significantly. We do believe that this isn't a Canadian issue. We do see around the world, both public and private sector, all organizations are thinking about self-service. But again, to my point before, no one has figured it out entirely yet. Everyone is going at this in I would call it a more pragmatic way, because of the fact that, especially in democratic countries, where you do need to offer, you still need to offer that in-person, that live CSR phone service to citizens who demand that. And so the point is, governments are not going entirely to self-service, either due to that desire to maintain service for people who don't want self-service, or simply for the notion of service continuity. And they don't want service disruptions as they are investing in self-service options. And that's a little bit of a complexity, I think, of implementation, is in many cases investments in self-service are being made, but what you might call more of a cautious approach because of that need to preserve service continuity and to make sure that any service outages, any service disruptions that might occur as new technologies are invested in can always be mitigated by in-person or call center options. The idea, and related to what I was just saying, that there seems to be a compelling business case for self-service when other channels are very expensive. The caveat being that you have to look, rather than a broad sort of brush look at the average cost of service, is a more specific or more detailed look at the programs involved. See, are there specific programs where service costs really do vary quite a bit from one channel to another, and perhaps where the business case for self-service is more compelling? And by the way, where you might be able to free up your staff to focus on other added value services that perhaps self-service could be assisting with. And again, that idea that key infrastructure is really required to enable self-service. Some specific recommendations, those are obviously some general ones. And first, across the country, when you think of for ICCS and various stakeholders as a whole, the notion of a coordinated and collaborative approach. And it's not just within, but it's across jurisdictions. And this is perhaps where there could be a pan-Canadian task force specifically focused on self-service. You can see the second point, that jurisdictions need to help educate citizens, have to promote it. Just by offering self-service, it doesn't mean that we're going to get that adoption. We need to have those proactive service migration strategies and tactics in place. The idea, as I was saying before, about having both capturing and publishing the transaction costs that you've got for delivering services across channels today. The all-in costs is what we find various jurisdictions typically lack, so that we're not necessarily starting this conversation with a common fact base. It's often first, what are my costs, and what is, as a result, that business case? How compelling is it? It's the idea of service bundles we talked a little bit about. It's creating, adopting strategies for that. But I personally feel that that's from a maturity standpoint, where a lot of organizations in Canada have achieved some great success, at least are innovating in that area and trying stuff. And the idea that government should be continually conducting research to understand what citizens are looking for in terms of self-service, and what is the impact of those initiatives we do have. Are they getting the services they need? Are they, in fact, migrating in a manner? I talked about the qualitative aspect of the service experience. We can still measure it, but we have to do that research and find out from citizens. And by the way, often when asking citizens and asking our CSRs, whichever channel they're focused on, that's some of the best ways to get some great innovative ideas that can then in turn be used to build better service impact or better service efficiency. More specifically, at the level of individual organizations, it's the idea of publishing a multi-channel service delivery strategy. What is your service delivery strategy? We often find is a question that people don't have. And without that strategy, it's often left to what I'll call the best efforts of various CSRs to, in their own minds, come up with the best service they can do, which obviously leads to a lot of inconsistency and second guessing. But we'll see jurisdictions that say, we want a specific focus on self-service. This is our priority. It's assessing the potential for alternative financing and delivery models. We're seeing a lot of that whole topic of alternative third-party providers being discussed and being implemented in many cases. We talked before about segmenting in order to understand and think about what are the barriers to self-service adoption. Is it simply a comfort level? Is it a more fundamental technology level, or perhaps services are just too difficult to understand through self-service? What are the reasons why people are not adopting it? Why we're not seeing more of those self-service penetration rates that we might expect? And finally, the notion of committing to and supporting national standards. Perhaps we talked before about some sort of national or central task force, but it's the idea of committing to national standards. And perhaps it's things like, again, publishing cost information through to standards around service delivery and common metrics that can be used so that as various Canadian jurisdictions and organizations go through this journey, you can be keeping tabs on each other, comparing notes with an apples-to-apples kind of discussion. So, I think that's where we stand. I'm sorry I took about 10 minutes more, but that still leaves us a good 10 minutes. Nicholas, if you want to take the mic back and any questions or comments that people might have.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. That's a terrific overview of the study. Of course, there's much more detail in the full report itself, and that's something that's gone out to all the members of the councils and to the research committee members. So please do go back and take a look at those areas that particularly interest you. I think there are a number of components and issues that are covered in that report, and as you were commenting in your final remarks there, Richard, depending on your jurisdiction or your program area and the level of development you're at and what particular issues are pressing your service agenda, different aspects of that report will be of different value and importance to you. So I do have some questions that are coming in. A reminder that if you want to ask a question, use the chat box on the lower right-hand side of your screen. And the first question I have, Richard, is around costing. And the question is, does the report provide a costing framework to facilitate benchmarking?
That's a good question. I've actually got my report handy. I think the answer is it probably doesn't at a very detailed level, because the problem we find with benchmarking is often the variable cost people have an idea for, but it's often fixed costs of service delivery, whether it's investments that are made, as an example, investments in technology, or fixed costs such as real estate. So the real estate cost of a call center is often one that's very complicated, and a lot of people don't have that. But what we do have is much more the variable cost, specifically for labor, which I think is a good benchmark. So my suggestion is when you look at that report, take it with a grain of salt, because the ranges are in there, but it's as you recall, a key recommendation is that we need a more precise measure for service delivery costs.
Okay, thank you, Richard. It's a tough question and a tough area, as you said, to get a handle on, but it's an effort we have to undertake, because without support from the senior leadership, we're not going to be able to move forward on some elements of that agenda. I have another question here that's also come in, and the question is, self-service is good, but automation is better. Can we discuss what opportunities there are between these two approaches?
Well, I would totally agree with the person who wrote in that comment. I'm not sure if automation is better. Automation is very, very important. But I think the two often go hand in glove. So automation in terms of forms being submitted and allowing sort of an end-to-end self-service form filling out, form delivery online. I think a problem that we often see is that people will, as an example, put a PDF file or PDF form online and say, well, we have self-service, but when you really look into it, the citizen has to take that form, they have to print it off on their computer, they have to sign it and fax it back, or some variation of that, and it truly isn't automation. And so that's why I do believe if you're really looking at self-service, put yourself in the citizen's shoes. Can they truly do this in an automated way, in a digital way? And I think the important message is if you're thinking about self-service, take a pure, if you will, definition of that. Don't just automation is often required, but again, the idea that you don't have to automate or you don't have to offer self-service across the board. There might be some key services that you got that are, whether they're particularly costly or particularly onerous for the citizen. The notion of a big bang approach to self-service we don't support. It's more the idea there might be some big, what I might call big rock opportunities where they're particularly costly, particularly cumbersome, and where automation and self-service can be offered, which is often a great way to start.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Another question. What led you to the conclusion that a pan-Canadian task force is needed?
I think that conclusion is based on the idea that there are, I think on the one hand, it's a very important topic. We work across jurisdictions in Canada, and every single province, every single municipality that we work with, and certainly the federal government, are talking about it. But what we believe is the idea of national standards, a sharing of national information, is whether it's around costs or whether it's around citizen needs. That's where we think that if we really want to drive not just the capability to have self-service, but the adoption by citizens of self-service, that's where we think a national task force might actually be a great idea. Again, we've seen a number of examples where the capability is offered, but citizens aren't necessarily adopting it, and it's not always logical. It doesn't feel. It feels like more concerted effort is required. It could be as simple as sharing best practices, or it could be national campaigns. But that idea of moving from capability to adoption is why we think that a national task force could be a wise idea. A number of jurisdictions are working in this area anyway. Why not pool together learnings and coordinate where that makes sense?
Okay, thanks again, Richard. I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll have to wind up. The one question I do have here is that in leading practices, in that section of the presentation, there were references to mining social media for feedback. Was there evidence related to that of any effective, comprehensive client feedback management?
I would say, evidence, I would say there are good anecdotal examples where we see a number of organizations reviewing that client feedback and responding to it. I think that whole sort of capability is very, very new. And so our opinion is it's not ingrained in processes yet. It's more like another data point of research that people are using to try to gauge how citizens are feeling about service, what kind of feedback, what kind of input they have, what's that conversation going on. And so if I can answer the question by saying I think the information is good, but people are still trying to figure out what to do with it, how to ingrain that in a more formal way into their processes. But I think, as you all know, often that needs to be those insights, those conversations, that feedback often needs to be taken with a grain of salt. It's qualitative feedback, that at the same time, it can be very, very useful.
Okay, well, thank you once again, Richard. I think that we're out of time for today's session, and so we need to close today's webinar. I'd like to thank you again, Richard, for this terrific overview of the study, and again encourage the participants to refer to that and mine insight from it. We look forward to the next webinar that you'll be presenting on May 22nd, focusing on the self-service maturity model as well, Richard. I'd like to thank also all of our participants who joined in. Following this webinar, you'll be sent a client satisfaction survey. We ask that you please take a few minutes to respond to help us improve our webinars. You'll also receive a copy of this deck for the presentation shortly, as well as a notice once the webinar, which is being recorded, is posted on the ICCS website. So you can watch it again as many times as you like, or send your friends and acquaintances to the site to see it as well. So with that, I'd like to thank you all and wish you a great day.